your child should be more motivated to participate in the mealtime and have a better response to eating because they're gonna feel hungry.
Hey, you're listening to The Rare Life. I'm your host, Madeline Cheney. I'm so excited to share with you a conversation with Kimball's feeding therapist, Kimberly Hurte. Feeding struggles in one way or another are actually super common. In this episode, Kimberly gives us some practical strategies that we can use to help them increase their variety and quantity at the table. Each of them are fun and creative, and so it's also there to help give a positive feeding experience, which I really appreciate. In this episode, Kimberly shares when a child should be receiving feeding therapy. So that may be of interest for those of you that are listening that are not seeing a feeding therapist and may benefit from one. Depending on your experience in the feeding world, some of these may be review and some of them may be brand new that you've never heard. But there are several strategies that she shares. And so instead of being overwhelmed by the amount of ideas, I encourage all of us to pick one and work on it. And then once that comes naturally, to pick another and work on it. It's been a successful way that we've been able to go about feeding therapy with Kimball because it can be a very slow and frustrating process. For about 9 months, we were receiving feeding therapy visits from an occupational therapist in early intervention. It was such a stressful topic for me because at this point, Kimball was not eating anything. He wouldn't put anything in his mouth. He had an extreme oral aversion. And it was so stressful that I failed to even put him in his high chair most days. I would feel really proud of myself if I put him in his high chair even once a week. And so finally, after months and months of just this really stressful thing that we were seeing very, very little progress in, his feeding therapist was like, do you even want him to eat food? Because if you're okay with him just drinking milk the rest of his life, we're done here. Like, you need to start doing the things I'm telling you to. And I was like, well, we're moving soon. And she was like, hey, once you move in and you get settled in, I encourage you to just go full force and really dig in and commit if this really is what you want for him. And I was like, okay. So we moved in and we got all settled, and then we started bringing Kimball to our local hospital outpatient therapy, and we met Kimberly. And because of that kind of pep talk that chastisement from his previous feeding therapist, I was ready to go. I was ready to really make some progress in his feeding. And so Kimberly was so great. I immediately liked her and trusted her, which is not a given for me. It takes me a little bit sometimes to warm up, but she is so great. And I hope that you will feel that too in this 30-minute episode that you're with her. She has her master's in speech language pathology, and she specializes in pediatric feeding and swallowing disorders. She hails from Colorado and lives in Utah with her husband, Kyle. She is a lover of backpacking and her chocolate lab. Let's jump into our conversation. Hi, Kimberly. Thank you for joining me today.
Hey, of course.
So, I am really excited to talk about feeding, and specifically for children that have a rougher time, to put it lightly, in the feeding sphere. And so, what would you say as kind of an intro for parents or educators that may be listening right now and also struggle with feeding with their child like I do with my son?
Yeah, it's really common for families to have difficulties getting their child to eat, whether it's eating anything by mouth, eating an increased variety, even just participating in meal times, being interested in coming to the table. All of that is really common. I think it's more common than people realize. And there's a lot of really simple things and simple strategies that families can implement to get started in the right direction with more positive meal times, which can really have a huge impact on like your overall day and just the dynamics of your family.
Yeah. Because I think feeding is such, you have to eat so frequently, whether you're being tube fed or eating at the table with the family. It's such a frequent thing that it really takes over your whole life. So if you're having positive experiences with eating with your child, then your whole day is more positive. And when you hit those roadblocks and you're frustrated and they're frustrated, then, it can really affect your whole day and therefore your whole life, day to day.
Totally. It's a very emotionally driven area too. There's a lot of emotion
Mm.
around meal times and eating. And so it can cause a lot of stress and anxiety for families. And I see that every day.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So, let's dive right into it. What would be, I love that we're going to talk a lot about today, some practical strategies that families can implement. And I will add, if you're seeing a feeding therapist in one form or another for your child already, a lot of these might sound familiar, or even just things you've heard, principles that are maybe more well known. But this can be one more little, like motivation to really try to implement some of these practical strategies. So, what would you say to a family that is struggling with eating? What are some strategies we can implement?
So the first thing that I always talk about with every family that comes in, the number one question I ask is, what is your schedule and your routine around feeding? I really like to know, I say start to finish in a 24-hour time period, when is your child being offered food and what does it look like when they're being offered it? So I really like to get detailed information on, are you sitting down for meal times? Is the family sitting together? Is it stressful? Are parents using positive words to describe meal times? We really kind of hone in on what that schedule looks like. And that's always the number one thing that I recommend families typically change. Most people come in with an atypical mealtime routine for their child. If feeding your child has been difficult, you tend to do whatever you can to get them to eat.
Right.
Kids tend to eat more if they're not in a stressful situation. So maybe while they're playing on the ground, they're snacking on graham crackers, or they have their goldfish in their little snack cup that they're walking around the house with. And parents are counting that as a win because they're eating, which is so true. And those are things to celebrate. But I always tell families, you're going to get more in the long run if you can have a structured schedule. The benefits to a structured schedule are going to be increased hunger drives. And so kids are going to have periods where they're eating and they're getting their stomachs full, and then periods where it's empty. So when it comes time to the next mealtime, your child should be more motivated to participate in the mealtime and have a better response to eating because they're going to feel hungry.
Right. I remember that was one of the first things we talked about when we came into you with Kimball, and we were able to finally, it's hard, especially when you want them to gain weight and you want them to eat. It's so hard to say no to them when they want food, because you're like, you just want them to eat. But when we actually started doing that, it took a while. Once we started finally implementing a schedule and saying no to him between meal times, we saw a huge increase in how much he was eating. And so that was really, I can get behind you on that one and say it works.
Yes. It usually takes parents a couple sessions. And just like you did, you came in and said, like, we're closer, but we're not quite there. A lot of the times it takes a couple sessions for